Today we will study and reflect on Nelson Mandela's autobiography, The Long Road to Freedom. We will study how the stoic values of Nelson Mandela matured and gave him strength to endure many decades of often meaningless manual labor in the South African prison system, and how he transitioned from prison to become the president of South Africa when the apartheid leaders realized they could never win the war against the freedom fighters and protesters of South Africa. How can we benefit from studying how Nelson Mandela stepped out of prison and into the presidency of South Africa? We can be inspired by his stoic efforts to reach out his hand to the white minority citizens of South Africa without resentment and end the apartheid system with a truly democratic government with universal suffrage for all racial groups without taking revenge for the years of brutality suffered by the native blacks of South Africa. We always like to select quotes directly from the author. At the end of our talk, we'll discuss our sources for this video and my blogs that cover this topic. Please, we welcome interest and questions in the comments. Sometimes these generate short videos of their own. Let us learn and reflect together. Prison made Mandela a living martyr. Nelson Mandela had the good fortune to be the first military director of the ANC just as it started its campaign of sabotage, which meant that he was the rarest of generals, the general who had no blood on his hands. His blood-free hands helped him to successfully make the transition to majority rule after apartheid was abandoned. Mandela was a stoic. He echoes Epictetus when he writes, "Prison and authorities conspire to rob each man of his dignity. No man or institution can rob me of my dignity because I refuse to part with it for any price or pressure. I never seriously considered the possibility that I would not emerge from prison one day." Bill Clinton tells us in the foreword to the autobiography, "I once asked Mandela to describe his long walk from prison to the presidency. When you are young and strong," he told me, "you can stay alive on hatred." And I did, many, many years. Then one day, after years of imprisonment, physical and emotional abuse, and separation from his family, Mandela said, "I realized that they could take everything from me except my mind and my heart. They could never take these from me. I still had control over my mind and my heart, and I decided never to give them away." Although much blood was shed after his imprisonment, he was spared the hell of war. He did not have to deal with the atrocities and terrorist acts on both sides. He was spared the difficult decisions that those still in the struggle had to make. Nelson Mandela's autobiography does not tell us the complete and ugly story of the bloody struggle that waged for decades, poisoning relations between white and black, which could have ended in misery similar to the misery being experienced in neighboring Zimbabwe today. Rather, Mandela's autobiography tells us the story of how he survived his prison experience with dignity and compassion for others intact, how he was able to reconcile white and black in a majority government for which he would be the first president soon after his release from prison. Mandela spent nearly 30 years of his life in a series of South African prisons. During this time, Mandela was the most famous prisoner in the world, and soon after he was incarcerated, the UN General Assembly imposed the first trade sanctions against South Africa. The ANC called for his release from prison, as did the Russian government, members of Congress and Parliament, and Adlai Stevenson, who was the American UN delegate. The entire ANC leadership was imprisoned, so its foreign arm abroad assumed the leadership of the party out of necessity. Acts of resistance and sabotage continued. The PAC, a new, more radical organization for blacks, was formed. Sometimes they cooperated with the ANC, sometimes they went their own way. The government, in its raids on ANC offices, discovered documents clearly linking Mandela to acts of sabotage. Mandela and the ANC clearly expected that he would become a martyr through a death sentence during his Rivonia trial, but the court instead sentenced him to life imprisonment. Many readers will choose to judge Mandela solely on whether they think he was a communist. Mandela quotes a speech at his trial addressing these charges. These are excerpts. The ideological creed of the ANC is the creed of African nationalism. We do not seek to drive the white man into the sea. We seek freedom and the fulfillment for the African people in their own land. The ANC has never advocated a revolutionary change in the economic structure of the country, nor has it ever condemned capitalistic society. It is true that there have been often close cooperation between the ANC and the Communist Party, but cooperation is merely proof of a common goal, and it is not proof of a community of interests. It is difficult for white South Africans to understand why experienced African politicians would so readily accept communists as their friends. But to us, the reason is obvious. Theoretical differences among those fighting against oppression is a luxury we cannot afford at this stage. For many decades, communists were the only political group in South Africa who treated Africans as human beings and their equals, who were prepared to eat with us, talk with us, live and work with us. Because of this, there are many Africans who tend to equate freedom with communism. Mandela spent nearly 2 decades as a prisoner working in the lime quarries of Robben Island, a remote prison off the South African coast. The harsh conditions he faced in his early years there eventually were improved over the years. Over the years, some wardens were more brutal, some wardens were more reasonable. Eventually, the manual labor lessened, and the manual labor was eventually abolished. Visitors were few. Visits were usually limited to 30 minutes. In the early years, prisoners were forbidden to receive newspapers. But since Mandela was a famous prisoner, the government avoided treating Mandela too harshly. Reporters, the Red Cross, and other international observers visited and interviewed Mandela on occasion. Sometimes the prisoners were even allowed to take correspondence courses through the university. Following the Soweto mass protests in 1976, more radical protesters from the Black Consciousness movement started filling the prison, including the prison on Robben Island. Mandela remembers, "These young men were a different breed of prisoner than we had ever seen before. They were brave, hostile, and aggressive. They would not take orders, and they shouted, 'Mandela,' which is Black Power, at every opportunity. Their instinct was to confront rather than cooperate. The authorities did not know how to handle them." Frustrated, the wardens asked Mandela to talk sense into them. He demurred. Instead, Mandela encouraged and befriended these young radicals, trying to see life through their eyes, which is how Mandela treated everyone. Mandela managed to win over many of these new prisoners, and many of them also joined the ANC. One day, the prison guards marched into a cell and told Mandela to pack up his things. He was going to be transferred with other top ANC leaders to a new prison. His new home would be Pollsmoor Maximum Security Prison in Cape Town. Mandela remembers, "Pollsmoor had a modern face but with a primitive heart. The buildings, particularly the ones for prison staff, were clean and contemporary, but the housing for the prisoners was archaic and dirty." But Mandela and other ANC leaders would have better accommodations. They had the entire 3rd floor to themselves. They each even had their own bathrooms, their own showers, and their own beds and sheets and towels. And they could feast on 3 meals a day of meats and vegetables. And they even read many magazines without the censors cutting out forbidden news. They even had their own spacious outdoor terrace, although they could not see through the 12-foot walls. When his wife Winnie visited, he could actually see her through a large pane of glass. And when visiting time was over, the guard would not bark, "Time up!" Instead, he would politely say, "Mrs. Mandela, you have 5 more minutes." The chapter for this period of his life, Mandela titles Talking with the Enemy. Indeed, the ruling National Party was starting to realize that majority rule was inevitable. They were coming under increasing political and financial struggle. New sanctions were imposed by the UN, the US, and other countries. More companies closed their operations in South Africa. Banks and investors decreased their holdings in the country. ANC acts of sabotage increased. Protests and riots and bloodshed on both sides kept increasing. And, worst of all, the South African football teams was excluded from international competition. The days of apartheid were numbered. In Parliament, President Botha of South Africa publicly offered Mandela his freedom if he would unconditionally reject violence as a political instrument. Mandela was permitted an extended visit with Winnie to discuss his response. His daughter Zinzi read his statement at a public rally at Soweto's stadium. Instead, let Botha renounce violence. Let him say he will dismantle apartheid. Let him reverse the ban on the People's Organization, the African National Congress. A few pages after this speech, Mandela writes that both sides regarded discussions as a sign of weakness and betrayal. But the goal of the ANC all along was to force the government to the negotiating table. Mandela thought the time had come to make the first step. He sent a simple letter to General Willemse, who was the Commissioner of Prisons, that he needed to see him on a matter of national importance. He was taken to the general's residence and told him that he wanted to meet Kobe Coetzee, who was the Minister of Justice. When asked why, Mandela simply said, "I want to see the minister in order to raise the question of talks between the government and the ANC." Now, it just so happened that Mandela at this time was going out on a limb. He had no discussions with the ANC on whether or not talks would be advantageous at this time. The minister happened to be in town, so they visited Coetzee at his residence, and he said that he would see if he could arrange a meeting with Botha. But you just cannot jump into a serious relationship all of a sudden. Some dating had to happen first. So Lieutenant Colonel Gowie Max, who was the deputy commander of Pollsmoor, wandered by his cell after breakfast one day and said quite casually, "Mandela, would you like to see the city?" Mandela was a little perplexed, but he said to himself, "Well, okay, why not?" So then the two of them walked out the 15 locked metal doors of the prison. Then they got into his waiting car and drove aimlessly down a lovely road on the coast of Cape Town. And the general stops to get a soda, leaving his prisoner in the car with the engine running. Mandela remembers, it was absolutely riveting to watch the simple activities of people out in the world. Old men sitting in the sun, women doing their shopping, people walking their dogs. It is precisely those mundane activities of life that one misses most in prison. I felt like a curious tourist in a strange and remarkable land. There were more trips out on the town. One warder actually took me to his family's flat and introduced me to his wife and children. From then on, I sent his children Christmas cards every year. And we see in these pictures of Cape Town how beautiful it could be, the streets of Cape Town and the coast of Cape Town, and one of the penguins that you can actually see on the beaches of Cape Town. One day, Nelson Mandela learned that he would again be transferred to the Victor Verster maximum security prison, which is now known as the Drakenstein prison. Mr. Max drove him to the prison grounds in a suburb of Cape Town. Nelson Mandela recalls, "We drove to the end of a rather wild, wooded area at the rear of the prison grounds. We came to an isolated, whitewashed, one-story cottage set behind a concrete wall and shaded by tall fir trees. A cottage all to himself. A cottage with a kitchen and a swimming pool and several nice bedrooms. No more sleeping on the floor or a simple bed. This was like living in a hotel. Mandela was even assigned an Afrikaner cook, Mr. Swart, so he could adequately entertain his ANC comrades and other guests. Mandela had to insist that he, not Mr. Swart, would wash the dishes and make his bed. Mr. Swart and Nelson became great friends. Mr. Swart had met him many years ago when he was a warder from Robben Island. Nelson and Mr. Swart compromised on which language they would use. Mr. Swart would speak to him in English, but Mandela would answer him in Afrikaans, the Boer language, so both could practice speaking the language which was their weakest. Nelson would later disarm his Boer opponents by speaking to them in fluent Dutch Afrikaans. The Dutch Boers had settled South Africa several hundred years before. Mandela was more familiar with the white Afrikaner history than many white Boers were. He would very patiently retell the history of his ANC movement, comparing the struggle the blacks experienced resisting apartheid to the struggles the Boers endured against the English to gain independence. Mandela always tried to see the world through the eyes of his opponents so he could find common ground for mutual understanding. Before a meeting with Botha could be arranged, some preliminary talks were needed. The first issue was that the government insisted that the ANC must renounce violence and give up the armed struggle before the government would agree to negotiations. Mandela responded that it is always the oppressor, not the oppressed, who dictates the form of the struggle. If the oppressor uses violence, then the oppressed have no alternative but to respond violently. Coetzee observed that the Boer National Party had stated repeatedly that it would not negotiate with any organization that advocated violence politically. What else could they do? Mandela simply responded, "Gentlemen, it is not my job to resolve your dilemma for you." Mandela had a good feel for when he would be conciliatory, when he should compromise, and when he should stand firm and resolute. The second issue was the relationship between the ANC and the Communist Party. Mandela said that the Communist Party did not control the ANC, that the ANC did not believe in the communist ideology, but that he would not disavow the assistance the Communist Party had provided them over the years. The third issue was whether the rights of the minorities, in particular the rights of the white minority, would be guaranteed under majority rule. Mandela's response was that the whites were Africans as well as the blacks, and that in any future dispensation the majority would need the minority. We do not wish to drive the whites into the sea. Shortly before he was released, Mandela got his meeting with Botha. Mandela was provided a suit and was smuggled into the presidential office. Botha staged a welcoming walk where they met in the middle of a grand hall, shook hands, and had their official picture taken, and then chatted in his office over tea about South African history. Botha's health was failing and he would soon resign. F.W. de Klerk would succeed him, and Mandela does not speculate in his autobiography, but perhaps the meeting was set up so Botha would be the first one to cross the Rubicon, so that de Klerk would not be the first South African president to meet face-to-face with Nelson Mandela. On the day of his release, the crowds were crowded with singing, dancing, jubilant Africans. And on that day, Mandela with his motorcade arrived late at the Cape Town City Hall for the planned celebrations. Mandela remembers to his surprise when a television crew thrust a long, dark, furry object at me. I recoiled slightly, wondering if that was some newfangled weapon developed while I was in prison. But my wife Winnie informed me that it was only a microphone. Negotiations began for the plan for the elections to a National Assembly that would write a new constitution and form a new majority government. Now that he was out of prison and real negotiations were proceeding, the violence escalated, and there were several incidents where the Boer police looked the other way while their Zulu opponents massacred the ANC supporters. Mandela had to walk a fine line between firmness and compromise to bring his country to the ballot box. After some debate and with Mandela's urging, the ANC declared that it would suspend its armed struggle, with the understanding that armed struggle could resume if the government showed bad faith. There was tension between the ANC and the ruling National Party of the Boers. Mandela and the ANC thought that the government was trying to negotiate a power-sharing arrangement that was little more than a watered-down apartheid. But the ANC realized that they could not effectively govern if the current civil servants running the government fled after the elections. In the end, they agreed that for the first 5 years that every major party would be represented in the cabinet, and after that there would be simple majority rule. The National Party lost an important by-election to a more right-wing party, so de Klerk scheduled a referendum so the white people of South Africa could vote on whether they supported the reform process that would lead to a new constitution through negotiation. The vote was 69% in favor, and mind you, only the whites were voting, giving de Klerk a great victory. Then the national campaign begun. The Zulu and Katha Party and the right-wing Conservative Party did not meet the party registration deadline, but Mandela enticed them to participate in the election. The ANC had an ambitious platform, which was only partially fulfilled upon election, which included creating jobs through public works, building 1 million new homes with electricity and flush toilets, extending primary health care and public education to all, and redistributing land through a land claims court, and enacting a value-added tax on basic foodstuffs. Often, Mandela told the black crowds, "Do not expect to be driving a Mercedes the day after the election or be swimming in your own backyard swimming pool. Life will not change dramatically, except that your self-esteem will increase and you will become a citizen in your own land. You must have patience. You must have to wait 5 years for results to start to show." And we see in the returns for this election that Mandela clearly won with over 62% of the vote. And in this chart, Buthelezi of the IFP, he was the leader of the Zulu party. The ANC won the election with 63% of the vote, and Mandela was happy that the ANC did not gain the 2/3 majority needed to draft the Constitution without input from the other parties. He did not want an ANC constitution, he wanted a South African constitution. In the closing pages of his autobiography, Mandela shares some comforting thoughts. No one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin or his background or his religion. People must learn to hate, and if they can learn to hate, then they can be taught to love, for love comes more naturally to the human heart than hate. Even in the grimmest times in prison, when my comrades and I were pushed to our limits, I would see a glimmer of humanity in one of the guards, perhaps just for a second, but it was enough to reassure me and keep me going. Man's goodness is a flame that can be hidden, but it can never be extinguished. Mandela is ever the stoic in the closing words of his autobiography. A man who takes away another man's freedom is the prisoner of his hatred. He is the one locked behind the bars of prejudice and narrow-mindedness. I am not truly free if I am taking away someone else's freedom, just as surely as I am not free when my freedom is taken away from me. The oppressed and the oppressor alike are robbed of their humanity in this situation. And now we'll discuss the source we use for this video. And the source that we use for this video, The Long Walk to Freedom, is a captivating autobiography, very easy to read, that covers the birth of the modern South African nation. There were many stories that we did not tell in this short video. During Nelson Mandela's time in prison, South Africa descended deeper and deeper into an unequal civil war between the races. The white Afrikaners at times had a loose alliance of convenience with the Zulu leaders that complicated the freedom struggle. This freedom struggle is discussed from Mandela's distant perspective from behind his prison bars. We read about the delicate negotiations in politics with both radical ANC members and far right-wing racist militias and how the political transition was negotiated. This includes a remarkable story of how the military leader of a far-right political party decided against starting an armed insurrection. He did not want blood on his hands, nor did the leader of the far-right party want to cause thousands more to perish in a futile armed struggle. Nelson Mandela was able to establish an imperfect democracy, for sure, but it has so far avoided the military coups and instability that haunts so many of its African neighbors. Please click on the link below for our blogs on Nelson Mandela, and please click on the links for interesting videos on other topics that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul. Thank you.